Have you ever watched someone make the same relationship mistake over and over, each time convinced that this next person will be different? The gambler's fallacy, why avoidants think they'll get it right next time, reveals a fascinating pattern that plays out in dating apps, coffee shops, and bedroom conversations across the world. Like a casino player who believes the next hand will finally be the winning one, people with avoidant attachment styles often fall into the same cognitive trap. The gambler's fallacy is the mistaken belief that past events affect future probabilities in random situations. A coin that lands heads 5 times in a row doesn't become more likely to land tails on the 6th flip. Yet humans consistently believe it will. This same flawed thinking shows up in how avoidant people approach relationships, creating a cycle that keeps them stuck in patterns they desperately want to break. Think about Blair Waldorf from Gossip Girl. She had her moments of emotional distance, believing that each new romantic situation would somehow be different from the last, despite bringing the same defensive behaviors to every relationship. The pattern repeats because the person hasn't changed, just the circumstances. Avoidant individuals convince themselves that the next partner, the next city, or the next job will magically solve problems that actually require internal work. Several cognitive biases fuel this cycle. The optimism bias makes people overestimate the likelihood of positive outcomes while underestimating negative ones. Confirmation bias causes them to focus only on information that supports their belief that this time will be different. The planning fallacy leads to unrealistic expectations about how smoothly things will go. These mental shortcuts, designed to help humans make quick decisions, become traps when applied to complex emotional situations. But here's what makes this particularly cruel for avoidant types. Their brain chemistry actually reinforces the pattern. Every time they pull away from intimacy, they get a small hit of relief from anxiety. This creates a reward system that makes the behavior stronger over time. The brain learns that distance equals safety, even when the conscious mind craves connection. Understanding this isn't about blame or shame. It's about recognizing that change requires more than just willpower. The stakes couldn't be higher. Relationships shape mental health, physical well-being, and life satisfaction in ways that ripple through every other area of existence. When someone gets stuck in avoidant patterns, they don't just miss out on love. They miss out on the growth that comes from genuine intimacy. They rob themselves and their partners of the deep satisfaction that comes from being truly known and accepted. If you want to better understand someone's attachment style, see the link in the description to one of the most popular books on attachment theory. Now let's dive into a story that illustrates exactly how this plays out in real life, and why breaking the pattern requires understanding forces that most people never even realize are at work. Marcus had dated 17 people in the past 3 years. Each relationship followed the same script, though he never noticed the pattern. The beginning always felt electric. Late-night conversations, shared jokes, that delicious uncertainty of early romance. But somewhere around month 3, when partners started expecting regular check-ins or wanted to meet his friends, Marcus would begin his retreat. First came the small delays in responding to texts, then missing a dinner here, cancelling weekend plans there. His partners would sense the shift and either chase harder, which made him pull back faster, or give him space, which he interpreted as lack of interest. Either way, the relationship would die a slow death, leaving both people confused and hurt. But here's where the gambler's fallacy kicked in with devastating precision. After each breakup, Marcus would analyze what went wrong and convince himself he'd figured out the secret formula. Sarah was too clingy, so next time he'd choose someone more independent. Jessica was too independent, so he'd find someone warmer. Patricia wanted too much too soon, so he'd take things slower with the next person. The problem wasn't the partners, It was Marcus bringing the same emotional unavailability to every situation while expecting different results. Like a gambler who thinks changing slot machines will change his luck, Marcus kept changing variables that didn't matter while ignoring the one that did, his own fear of vulnerability. This pattern reached its peak with someone he met at his friend's wedding. Rachel seemed perfect, successful, funny, gave him plenty of space. For 6 months, things felt different. Marcus started thinking he'd finally cracked the code, that he'd learned from all those past relationships and found his person. He even started talking about moving in together. But when Rachel suggested they spend Christmas with her family, the familiar panic set in. Suddenly, every conversation felt suffocating. Her laugh seemed too loud. The way she left a toothbrush at his place felt invasive. Within 2 weeks, Marcus had manufactured a fight and ended things, leaving Rachel devastated and confused. Standing in his apartment afterward, surrounded by the silence he'd fought so hard to preserve, Marcus finally realized he was living the same story over and over. The names and faces changed, but his reactions stayed identical. The gambler's fallacy had convinced him that external changes would create internal transformation, when the real work had never even begun. That moment of recognition becomes the foundation for everything that comes next, because awareness is always the first step toward genuine change. Understanding this pattern is only valuable if it leads to different choices. The path forward requires specific strategies that address both the conscious beliefs and unconscious patterns driving avoidant behavior. These aren't quick fixes or simple mindset shifts. They're fundamental changes in how someone relates to themselves and others. The first step involves recognizing emotional triggers before they create distance. Avoidant people often don't realize they're pulling away until the damage is already done. Learning to identify the physical sensations that precede emotional withdrawal, the tight chest, shallow breathing, sudden irritation, creates space for conscious choice instead of automatic reaction. This means developing what therapists call emotional granularity. Instead of just feeling overwhelmed or smothered, practice identifying specific emotions. Are you feeling scared of disappointment, worried about losing independence, anxious about being judged? The more precisely you can name what's happening internally, the less power these emotions have to drive unconscious behavior. But awareness alone isn't enough. The next crucial step involves challenging the stories that justify emotional distance. When the urge to pull away kicks in, instead of immediately acting on it, pause and examine the narrative playing in your head. Are you telling yourself that your partner is becoming too needy, that the relationship is moving too fast, that you're just not ready for this level of commitment? These stories often contain a grain of truth wrapped in layers of distortion. Yes, maybe your partner did ask more questions than usual about your day, but does that actually mean they're trying to control you? Or could they simply be showing interest and care? The avoidant mind tends to interpret normal relationship behaviors as threats to autonomy, creating problems where none actually exist. Here's where the cognitive bias work becomes essential. Start documenting your relationship predictions and checking them against reality. Write down what you expect to happen when you open up emotionally or spend more time together. Then track what actually occurs. Most avoidant people discover that their fears are dramatically larger than the actual consequences of intimacy. The confirmation bias makes this especially tricky because the brain naturally focuses on evidence that supports existing beliefs. If you expect your partner to become clingy, you'll notice every text message and phone call while ignoring the times they give you space. Deliberately looking for disconfirming evidence, moments when intimacy led to positive outcomes, helps rewire these automatic thought patterns. Building tolerance for emotional discomfort represents another critical skill. The anxiety that comes with vulnerability isn't actually dangerous, even though it feels overwhelming. Learning to sit with these sensations without immediately escaping through distancing behaviors takes practice, but it's absolutely essential for lasting change. Start with small exposures to intimacy. Share one slightly personal thing about your day. Ask your partner about their feelings instead of avoiding emotional conversations. Make plans more than a few days in advance. Each time you choose connection over distance, you're literally rewiring your brain to associate intimacy with safety instead of threat. Remember Love Quinn from the Netflix series You. Her attachment issues played out in extreme ways, but they illustrate how people can get trapped in patterns where they desperately want connection, but consistently sabotage it through their own behaviors. The key is catching these patterns early before they create the very outcomes you're trying to avoid. Communication strategies become crucial during this process. Instead of disappearing when you feel overwhelmed, practice expressing what's happening internally. Tell your partner when you're feeling scared or need some space to process emotions. Most people can handle honesty about your internal experience much better than sudden withdrawal with no explanation. This doesn't mean dumping every fear and anxiety on your partner, but it does mean being transparent about your patterns and actively working to change them. When you feel the urge to create distance, say something like, "I'm noticing myself wanting to pull away right now, but I don't actually want to damage our connection. Can we talk about what I'm feeling instead?" The goal isn't to eliminate all need for space or independence. Healthy relationships require both closeness and autonomy. The goal is making conscious choices about when and how to take space, instead of letting unconscious patterns drive behavior that hurts both you and your partner. Now comes the part that determines whether all this understanding actually creates lasting change in your life. Change happens not in the dramatic moments, but in the small daily choices that compound over time. Every single day presents opportunities to choose connection over distance, vulnerability over protection, growth over comfort. These moments might seem insignificant, but they're actually the building blocks of transformation. The gambler's fallacy loses its power when you stop believing that external changes will solve internal problems. The next relationship won't be different unless you show up differently. The next city won't heal your attachment wounds. The next job won't fix your fear of intimacy. This might sound harsh, but it's actually liberating. It means you have the power to create change regardless of circumstances. Think about Camille from Emily in Paris. She had her own struggles with emotional availability and kept expecting different outcomes from the same behaviors. Real change requires looking inward instead of constantly adjusting external variables. It means doing the uncomfortable work of examining why intimacy feels threatening and slowly building tolerance for the vulnerability that genuine connection requires. The path forward isn't about perfection, it's about awareness and course correction. You'll still have moments of wanting to run from closeness. You'll still feel overwhelmed by a partner's emotional needs sometimes. The difference is catching these patterns earlier and responding from choice instead of automatic reaction. Start treating your relationships like laboratories for growth instead of pass or fail tests. Each interaction becomes data about your patterns and an opportunity to practice responding differently. When you notice yourself starting to withdraw instead of following through automatically, pause and ask what you're actually afraid of. Most of the time, the fear is much bigger than the reality. Build a support system that understands attachment patterns and can help you stay accountable to your growth. This might include therapy, trusted friends who know your patterns, or support groups for people working on similar issues. Changing deeply ingrained behaviors is hard work that's much easier with support and guidance. Remember that setbacks aren't failures, they're information. If you fall back into old patterns of emotional distance, don't use that as evidence that change is impossible. Use it as data about what triggers are still difficult for you and what additional skills you need to develop. Every step backward can become 2 steps forward if you approach it with curiosity instead of self-criticism. The people who successfully break free from avoidant patterns share one crucial characteristic. They become willing to feel uncomfortable in service of something larger than their immediate comfort. They choose the temporary discomfort of vulnerability over the long-term pain of isolation. They risk being hurt in order to experience genuine love. This doesn't mean becoming a different person or abandoning your need for independence. It means expanding your capacity to be both autonomous and connected, both strong and vulnerable, both self-reliant and interdependent. These aren't contradictions. They're the hallmarks of emotional maturity. Your attachment style isn't your destiny. It's simply the strategy you learned for getting your needs met in relationships. Those strategies made sense given your early experiences, but they might not serve your current goals and values. You have the power to develop new strategies that honor both your need for autonomy and your deep human need for connection. The gambler's fallacy keeps people trapped in cycles of hope and disappointment, always believing the next hand will be different while playing the same game. Breaking free means changing the game entirely, shifting from looking for the perfect external circumstances to developing the internal capacity for sustained intimacy. That's where real transformation lives, and that's where your next relationship actually can be different. The choice, as always, is yours.
Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to better understand avoidance, relationships, and psychological biases, then subscribe to our channel, because you deserve beautiful relationships.